Hi again, everybody. Welcome into another edition. This is Cross Functionality, the show connecting coaching, baseball, softball, male, female, hosted by former college baseball and softball players. Cassie is still out on maternity leave, so here we are, episode 66, the second episode of 2024. And I want to bring in Dr. Nick Serio joining us today on episode 66. Nick, thank you for filling in and being our guest co-host this week.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
You know, you have an
I hope I
interesting
can
background.
I hope I can
Go
fill
ahead.
Cassie's shoes. That's a tough one.
I think she's done the show from that same spot, so you
Yes,
almost
I
literally
agree.
are in her shoes in a way. Um, you have an interesting background, and by the way, for those who don't know, you are Cassie's business partner. I have that
Yep.
correct? And you and her work pretty much side by side, coaching baseball and softball athletes. You have an interesting background, a great resume, obviously the doctor in front of your name. In today's episode, we will focus mostly on baseball and softball, mental performance, physical performance. But the first thing I want to ask you from your perspective, and I've talked to Cassie about this before on this show, when you're coaching baseball and softball players, what are some of the biggest differences? What are some of the biggest similarities? And how do you intersect the two and then combine them to be able to help your athlete the best way possible?
You're referencing between baseball and softball?
Yes.
Um, Females tend to mature at a younger age, so they're a lot easier to work with early on in terms of their attentiveness and their drive. And from what I've learned about the game of softball from Cassie, they tend to be recruited a lot earlier too. So their necessity to be more mature at a younger age is definitely prevalent. In terms of like the actual sport and like how they move and everything, softball just tends to be shorter, faster, and if you think about it, like smaller circles, where baseball, especially when you're talking about pitching, right? We allow ourselves to have a little bit longer of a time to create a throw.
Yep.
Um, but ultimately, at the end of the day, they're getting very similar action, and it there is it there is a ton of crossover when just teaching the art of throwing to either of those athletes. Now, when you're getting specific in baseball and you're going towards pitching, obviously there's major differences there.
And you have obviously a specialization in pitching as well. Um, when you look at pitchers today, and I think that the whole industry should be looking at the coaching industry anyway, probably should be looking at this as a whole. The amount of pitchers that have had Tommy John surgery, the amount of pitchers that are getting hurt. What is your approach now in the year 2024, going back the last couple of years, seeing all of these injuries and seeing the trends within the pitching industry of coaching? What's your approach now in helping pitchers, helping them develop and trying your best to get them to avoid those type of injuries that could cost them up to a year?
Yeah, sure, and even more if we're talking about the shoulder. Data. You have to have some kind of metrics. You have to have a baseline. You have to have something that you're able to go off of to quantify where is this person at. Because just I feel good today isn't good enough from a coaching perspective any longer, especially with some of the devices that you have out there in the world right now. We use the arm care unit quite a bit, which is just a basic dynamometer that gives you an isometric strength reading. So we'll use that. We'll also use our force plates. It'll give us a reading on whether or not the athlete is, neurologically prepared for the demands that we're going to put them through that day. But again, none of it is a perfect science, right? And when you're trying to toe the line of, achieving a new level of what you're capable of, yeah, there's going to be moments in time where that can occur. But the alternative is, slow your development and take your time doing. And we can live in that world if you want to live in that world, but that's pretend. Because every college is going to recruit off velocity. Every pro scout is going to look at that, number one, because ultimately at the end of the day, it creates a larger problem for a hitter the harder you throw.
Yeah. Does that worry you though as a coach that may be causing more and more injuries?
The quest for it, Yeah, I mean, listen, it's certainly going to cause more injuries if you're not in a situation, a program, with a coach who's going to heavily monitor that and determine what might be injurious and what might not be. I mean, look, the number one thing we say off the bat to anybody out there that's considering improving their performance, if you don't have an initial eval to go off of, you're training blindly. So regardless if you weren't going to train with us in the future or any of these other really well established facilities, pay the money to go get the guidance. So even if you're not going to continue training with them, at least they can point you in the right direction and tell you where you should be going. Because there's enough technology out there nowadays that you can get at least a baseline and you can get a good understanding of what direction you should be pushing towards with your training. Going at it blindly, it doesn't have to be an answer for anybody any longer. You can get a high level coach for an evaluation for $100.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, when you put it that way, it does make it interesting with the way the industry has changed. And now with coaches having to almost tailor their coaching ways, I would think, especially pitching coaches, obviously, with the new data out there. And for kids who come in wanting to throw as hard as they see other people throwing and then trying to get recruited. And now you add in that other caveat as well, which is the NIL money. You're not just getting recruited anymore. You're possibly getting recruited to go to a big school where you may actually get paid to play that said sport. So I understand where you're coming from as a coach, trying to get the player to where they actually want to be and not necessarily put the injury part aside, but trying to work around that.
You can't beat velocity. I mean, it's not going anywhere. It changes the game from all perspectives. So no, it's never going anywhere. I mean, the NIL money in college baseball isn't what it is in a lot of these other sports, but getting the opportunity to play at a high level school or even in college is largely going to be determined on what can you showcase as your top end velocity. And then sure, a lot of people are going to then off of that look and, hey, can this kid pitch? Can he actually do all the other intangibles? But if you don't have that first metric to get you in the door, it's really hard to get eyes on you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just, how many guys do you know at the college level that are pitching that are consistently dominating at 83? It just doesn't happen.
You're exactly right. Now, not everybody is Paul Skeens, right? At LSU last year, throwing 100 and 103, 105. How do you tailor your coaching methods to someone who just doesn't have the genetics to throw 95 plus?
Well, we're still just trying to achieve what their pinnacle is, right? And in an appropriate manner. So, the misconception, I think, too, and this is the dichotomy of social media, when you're trying to provide information in such a short, condensed period of time, whether that is due to the platform giving you that condensed period of time or the attention spans of the consumer, you get certain context lost, right? And so the quest to throw extremely hard, I'm not saying it should be done from age 13. I'm not saying it should be done even potentially for some guys at age 15. It's, you really have to look at how mature is this individual? How much time have they spent really understanding their own mechanics? How much time have they spent really navigating what it feels like to push themselves to a certain level? Because all of these things weigh into, is this individual at a risk of hurting themselves if we start to put them in some kind of program that is going to test their ability to throw hard? And here's the other thing I'll say to that is, you're not going to throw hard without throwing hard. So, you can't have an athlete throw 80% bullpens for months on end and assume all of a sudden he's going to come out and his top end velocity is going to be significantly higher if he's a mature individual. Look, if they're young, you probably could have done a host of things and they would have been better.
Yeah. So my question for you, by the way, follow Nick on social media at Velo University, at coach_Serio on Instagram and Twitter. And another question I have for you, you have an expertise in mental side of things? How do you work with athletes, just overall in general, working with athletes from the mental side and get them better mentally?
So every time that we talk about the word mental, right, we end up thinking, okay, everybody has it happen, right? They think, okay, that's like a 1-to-1. We're going to sit down. I'm going to sit on a chair. They're going to sit in a couch and we're going to talk about their feelings. Um, Mindset is globally, right? It occurs all day long. It occurs in every domain that you have. It's not just in the domain we happen to be working on at that moment in time. So how we work with all of our athletes is we are constantly working with our coaches on understanding the ramifications of language and understanding the importance of the words that are coming out of your mouth and how are they directed and in what manner and what's the purpose behind those words. Don't just say words to fill space. Use the time that you have and the language that you have access to actually deliver a message that you feel is pertinent to that athlete. And then most of the time, just shut up and listen because that's what the athlete is yearning for. If you can actually draw a conversation out of a young individual, you're going to learn an immense amount if you actually listen, actively listen to the words that they're saying, the tone at which they're saying it, when they're accentuating certain words or certain emotions that are going on during that time. And if you're constantly, when you're in those conversations, my greatest suggestion to any coach is just keep at it. And you'll eventually get to the point where you can really understand why this individual or what this individual is trying to get across to you, the message they're trying to have you hear. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's how you're going to be able to help them, is to truly understand what's going on between their ears. I mean, as an example, we've had some really, really high level athletes all of a sudden have the incapacity to. So we've had some high level athletes who are performing really well. Everything's going really well, right? And we're about to transition them back to the mound. And all of a sudden, this is in the off season, but maybe we've taken a step away from the mound. We're working on other things. And all of a sudden, they look like a totally different person. They can't do anything they've been doing over the last 6 to 8 weeks. And you have to take a step back and just think, like, what has changed? The environment has changed. Even though they're in the same facility, even though we've now added the mound back, and you have to wonder what level of anxiety is actually occurring because of this mound. And now there is such an important conversation to be had with this athlete, and you can't approach it by going up and being like, oh, you're scared of the mound, right? You have to try and empathize with them, truly understand what they're going through, put yourself in their shoes, understand their backstory, and then you can help them navigate through that anxiety, get over it, and, unleash the animal that most likely is inside.
So, what kind of mental assessment do you do if you're trying to sell a parent on coming to your academy, you and Cassie? What kind of assessment are you doing with that athlete to better understand their points of weakness and their points of strength?
Well, they're going through a movement screen, a performance profile, like a power profile. They're going through a throwing analysis. And then there's a lot you can tell when somebody walks in the door. So if there was like, is there a mental side to your analysis? It's happening from every coach, and it's as the individual is walking in the door, right? So an athlete walks in our door for an evaluation, the coach is introducing them to every other coach that's there. The way in which that individual interacts with those other coaches gives us a great indication of what type of athlete this is going to be to work with, right? If they're secluded and reserved and they don't reach out their hand, they're not making a handshake gesture, or they're not trying to close the gap between the coach and themselves, we understand this athlete's a little reserved. Then we can look at the facial expressions that they're having while they're making this or not making this gesture, and you can read whether that's reservation or whether they're just not confident in what we have to offer. Whereas the vice versa, when you have an athlete who's overly like emphasizing the introduction. They're enjoying the conversation. It's a firm handshake. There's direct eye contact. You have an athlete who's probably already bought in, and this is an individual that we can make some really big strides right away because we're not having to step over these hurdles of, trying to get them to feel what it feels like to be in this environment. Not saying that that's more enjoyable or anything like that. It's just when you have an athlete like that, you can get to the ground running right away, as opposed to the opposite. There's some time trying to figure out how to help them navigate in this environment. But ultimately, the movement screen is about uncovering any red flags that might exist from whether that's a joint perspective, whether that's a like joint congruency perspective, or whether that's a movement-based perspective, like we work global to specific. And then the power profile is we use our force plates, we use certain performance metrics, we have laser timers for sprinting. So there's like that force profile gets created, and then finally there's a throwing profile off of them. So all of that coupled together gives us a starting point, right? And
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
any program, any individual, anything that says to you you're not getting a cookie cutter program is lying to you, because you absolutely are. You are getting a program that has likely bucketed you, and now that you've been bucketed, the reason it has to be cookie cutter is because that has been proven to work with other people. And now over the next month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, it becomes individualized based on the communication from the athlete to the coach. Without that, there's no individualization that could occur.
So the cookie cutter program, it becomes cookie cutter when it works for another athlete, right? And I'm guessing there what you're saying is cookie cutter programs aren't necessarily bad because they've worked for so many other people, right?
It's your base. It's what you're starting with, right? You've bucketed this individual to represent some level, and there might be even small tweaks even in that initial program that are varieties of all these different templates that have been created, right? But you have to start with something that operates successfully. If I get a new athlete in and I'm like, ooh, I'm going to over individualize I don't know that works. There's nothing in that I can step back to anecdotally, or yeah, sure, maybe I can rely on some science-based stuff, but all of those generalized science-based principles are in every one of those programs anyway. So anything that I'm claiming is hyper individualized, I'm taking a guess because I'm not totally sure that is specific enough for this athlete and what will work.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's switch gears here. I want to ask you about technology, and feel free to disagree with me here. But I'm looking at all technology now across baseball and softball coaching, and doing a lot of research on this. And it feels like there was a technology craze, there was a technology peak with how it was being manufactured, how things were being developed, say maybe 3 to 5 years ago. And it seems like things have sort of slowed down a little bit when it comes to technology. A lot of the programs and systems, software that has proven to work and help athletes get better has sort of taken a foothold within the coaching industry. Is that how you see technology in 2024? And where do you kind of see that technology when it comes to coaching players evolving?
So I would actually say that there are new technologies that are coming out that might prove beneficial. And I think a lot of times the reason it's not so mainstream for people to hear about some of these technologies or anything is because these companies are very worried about jumping into the market before they're actually ready to jump into the market, because there are long-standing monsters in these markets that will crush them if they're not prepared. So I think they do a lot of testing nowadays, and we'll get contacted by quite a few of them as they're trying to test it out, because there's a large battery of athletes that we can run people through. So I think technology has its place.
Mhm.
I think the technology that cannot be argued with, that is absolutely necessary, is in-game technology. In-game technology giving us information back from how an athlete is actually performing, the data from that, how they're feeling pre and post it. That is unequivocally so crucial. Now, from a training aspect, sometimes it is massively overblown. In other scenarios, we've seen it be incredibly productive. But it is all in how is the information disseminated to the athlete. You have to remember that. That is the most important piece of any technology, right? So if technology is really confusing, takes forever to like aggregate and get the information into a consumable manner, it's a waste of time. Doesn't matter how valuable it's going to be to me, I can't use it. And a lot of times when companies are giving us stuff, that's our like first feedback. It's like, listen, really like your product. It's an amazing product. I think it's going to do really well, likely with the pro level, but I don't have 10 minutes to give to each guy to have them go through this specific thing when I can only get them in my building for 120 minutes and they need to do a whole heck of a lot of stuff that's likely to be more impactful than just this one thing you're giving me.
Yeah. When Dr. Nick Serio, I appreciate you doing this today. And again, follow Nick at coach_Serio on Instagram and Twitter, or at Velo University. One last piece before we exit here, episode 66 of Cross Functionality. Follow myself on Instagram and Twitter at Jim Tara as well. Email us your questions, jimbopodcast21@gmail.com. It isn't the new year, 2024. What's your biggest advice for athletes, baseball and softball, going forward as we head into the new season, which for some people, it's only a couple of weeks away, Division II, Division III, collegiate level, Division I, about 5 weeks away, and then so on and so forth.
So we talked earlier about mindset. There's one attribute that every successful human being, regardless of what industry, domain, whatever it is they do, there's one thing every single one of them possesses, and that is the ability to remain consistent. The ability to remain consistent, I promise you, will pay long-term dividends regardless, even if you're going in the wrong direction. If you're going in the wrong direction, by being consistent about tracking, about understanding what's going on, about understanding how and what it is we're supposed to be doing, you will eventually figure out faster than the person that was inconsistent going in the wrong direction. So whenever we're working with athletes and they're really struggling mentally with their sport, the first things we do is we tackle their nighttime routine and morning routine, and we do it in that order. Nighttime first, morning second. And the reason is we want to add guardrails to their day so that we can get them to understand that they will have consistency at the end and at the beginning of the next day, no matter what they do in the middle. And they can start to move that consistency towards the middle of the day in the rest of their life. But if they can take care of those two things, and I promise you, try it, you will see unbelievable results in everything else you do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Consistency and longevity. I think that's the real key to success, and really what makes a successful person is the longevity. It's not the successes short-term or the short-term failures. I think that it's all encompassing, and it's that longevity. We see it with some of the best athletes, and of course, Nick Saban, who, Cassie and I have talked about a lot on this show, and some of his coaching principles, his longevity, and his consistency. It's right now at this point, right, in college athletics, unmatched. And that's exactly consistency. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And longevity as well. I'm a big longevity guy.
Yeah.
Success over a long period, or even just, I think consistency and longevity, people, when they go to the gym, when they go work out, if they're able to do it year in, year out, that's that consistency. I think that's ultimately what makes them successful. Of course, training the right way, but like you mentioned, you will eventually figure it out if you are consistent. All right. Well, Nick, thank you very much for doing this again. Email us your questions, jimbopodcast21@gmail.com, and we will talk to you next week.